Hello everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon. You are here for the L&D Predictions webinar for Thrive. You're joined by myself, I'm Mark Ward, I'm one of the founders here at Thrive, and Helen.
Hi everyone, I'm Chief Learning Officer here at Thrive and great to be here.
And this has become something of a tradition for us that we were kind of chuckling about. We've done a few of these now. And basically at the start of the year, Helen and I talk quite a lot about the trends that we're seeing, some of the interesting reports and insights that have come out maybe towards the back end of the year. And the key thing that we're looking for is to make sure that we're giving you actionable insights. So the whole point of this is hopefully it's giving you food for thought about things that you can take forward for the rest of the year. And from that perspective, we will jump in. And we're going to start off by having a bit of a look back through last year's points and kind of what were we talking about this time last year. A number of different items there, many of which remain relevant and will continue to be on the agenda. In particular, social learning is something that I think we're seeing greater adoption of and recognition of the value that it's bringing. And I think that's going to include, so it's going to continue the more that we see, Gen Z entering the workplace and that expectation around being able to knowledge share very readily and easily. I think another thing that was really notable was the way in which we saw kind of coaching and mentoring taking more of a prominent role within the conversations at conferences and that kind of stuff. And I think we're starting to recognize the value that mentoring has within the workplace and the point at which, actually that form of learning can plug a gap that maybe other forms can't. And so that was really interesting to see. Data storytelling is a topic that we're going to touch on today again. But again, I think there was quite a lot that we saw there in terms of success of starting simple and being able to maybe piece together the kind of bigger picture as we kind of moved into then communicating with the business and sharing what success looked like. And there's a lot that we've seen there from some of our customers where we've helped to kind of really get into and dig into some of the problems that maybe they want to explore with data projects. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more as well. And then finally on inclusivity, it's a word and a topic that you're going to hear us touch on quite a lot today. It remains one of the focuses for us, and there's still lots of things to kind of explore on that. What didn't we mention? We were chatting about this and trying to remember why. Generative AI is obviously a massive topic. I think last year we discussed elements of it and maybe didn't feel like we could kind of bring enough actionable insight to it. This year there's going to be a lot for us to talk about around generative AI and the impact that it's having. So without further ado, we will kind of start moving forward. Before we go to kind of looking at some of the key problems that we think are on the radar at the moment, we wanted to set you a little bit of homework for the comments and really ask you to kind of share maybe some of what your objectives might be for 2024. So yeah, set yourself in that mental frame. You're at the end of the year, you've achieved something great and you're celebrating that with your team. What kind of topics, what themes would you be celebrating ideally? So we're going to come back to that in just a moment, but yeah, please do drop in the comments any thoughts that you've got around your objectives for this year.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear what people and see what people come back with there. And like Mark says, we'll come back to it in just a moment. But before we look at your answers that you'll provide to us in the chat there, one of the things that we really like to do here at Thrive is that we don't want to just look at buzzwords and trends and predictions and leave you kind of high and dry with those and off you go into the year. Actually, what we want to be looking at, and the same applied last year for this webinar, is what are the problems that people are experiencing. So we look at what our customers are talking about and then what's going on in the wider industry too. And a lot of the problems still remain. It's not like between 2023 and 2024 things have drastically changed and you're not going to be focused on some of the similar problems, but actually there's some new things that need to be focused on and refocus on other areas. So whilst we spoke last year around kind of talent mobility and competition for talent, and those are still relevant problems for people within various organizations, we're not really going to dig into too much detail on those today. However, things like measurable business alignment, communication and relationship building, and inclusive approaches were things that we mentioned last year in terms of problems that organizations are facing. This year, we're looking at embracing new technologies as a key problem within certain organizations. So what do we mean by all of these things? Well, in order to align more effectively with a business, you need to be looking at what the goals are and how they're being communicated across business, not just into the L&D team. But in order for an L&D team to prove measurable impact, they need to have really close alignment across a business to what those organizational objectives are, but also what's going on in those departments and sections across a business too. And in order to do that, you need to be developing clear relationships, clear communication. Again, a problem that exists across a business. It's not just necessarily something that an L&D team are dealing with, but really how do L&D teams develop the right relationships within a business, create trusted partners in their different business units or areas? How do they create L&D partners across the business too? And then how do you kind of make sure that you're communicating the right stuff at the right time to the right audiences too? In terms of embracing new technologies, obviously over the past 12 months, there's been well, actually even longer than that, there's been an influx of AI, particularly into the workforce, and that's posed in itself some challenges, particularly for L&D teams to deal with. And as we've said, we'll dig into that in more detail as we go. But it's certainly an area that becomes a little bit tricky, particularly with AI and when you're thinking about kind of data security and things like that as well, which we'll touch on in a moment. An inclusive approach to learning and what that means in terms of creating a sense of belonging within an organization is really important. So we're looking, yes, at things like accessibility, but we're also looking at what those touch points are in an entire employee experience. And that's why, obviously, we've highlighted employee experience there along the bottom as something that is really important to solving all of these problems. So it's something that underpins everything within an organization, and it runs through all of those different touch points that you deal with. So we're really thinking there around creating a holistic employee experience. And that's really where the future is headed for us. And then underpinning that, you've got thinking strategically. It's something that we hear a lot of the time. L&D teams are told that they need to think more strategically. And I think that's certainly true as we head into this year and we think about how we're going to solve some of these problems. And what do we mean, I suppose, on a practical level in terms of thinking strategically? Well, we often see L&D teams thinking quite reactively and tactically to situations. And we really do feel that in order to start proving impact and being able to communicate that impact, there needs to be a real balance with strategic thinking within an organization. So, for example, if you have a set of new starters or early career people within your business that you suddenly noticed a higher level of attrition, perhaps L&D teams have been approached by a business partner to say that they've seen that happening, and actually can L&D help to provide some training on those key skills for those that group of people. Yes, L&D can do that, they can deliver that training, but actually what's going to be the wider impact there? Well, actually, if they were thinking more strategically, they'd be actually talking to those that group of that audience, that user group. They'd be understanding what is going on, what are the real challenges, and then looking at all the different touch points where L&D could feed into it as well. So it's that kind of longer term view of how things that you're doing now feed into that wider picture. And I think it's really important that we start to think more like that in the future. So I think now would be a really good time to take a look at some of the stuff that's going off in the chat. And Mark, hopefully you've had a chance to be absorbing some of what's going on there.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of really good objectives in there, and a lot of the themes that we're seeing in the comments relate to the kind of problem areas that we're touching on. So just to kind of call out a couple of them. Yeah, so maybe enhancing our training offer with AI digital tools to reflect 2024. I think there's a couple of comments along those lines, and again, very much in line with kind of embracing new technologies. stuff in terms of kind of thinking about the way that we're delivering learning, or how we're supporting learners to maybe feel more supported themselves. And again, I think that kind of links with the inclusive approach. There's a comment that just came in actually about improving employee experience for mothers, parents in the workspace. I think that relates as well, and very much I can relate to that being a challenge. Yes, and then around kind of business alignment, a few different elements there. So I'm just trying to pull out where that one came in. Connecting learning more clearly with business and individual performance, and with individual accountability and ownership. And I think, yeah, all of these themes that we're talking about are very much coming out there. So there's some great suggestions in the kind of comments there. Okay, and probably, yeah, just worth kind of going back to those problems. We're going to move on now. In a moment, we're going to start to kind of think about some of our key focus areas, but hopefully this is kind of established as elements that underpin the tone of where we're at as a sector right now. So how do we see these problems playing out over the course of 2024? And there's probably some elements that are going to be. It would help if I was looking at the right notes. I've got myself confused now. Sorry, just one second. Yeah, so as we look forward through 2024, we're going to focus on kind of a couple of key focus areas. But Helen, I think you've got a bit of a quote. There's some interesting studies that have been going on, and one of them in particular has been drawing your attention.
Yeah, I think the Accenture Tech Vision 2024 report is well worth a look if you haven't already seen it. And one of the key underlying themes of that report is the interesting tension between the analogy that they use for the interesting tension between humans and technology in sci-fi literature or films, because in those situations, tech is always seen as a bit of an evil force that's going to take over the world. Whereas, and that kind of historic view of technology is it's helping people in certain situations to do things that they can't do. Whereas as we move into this year, in even as close a term as this year, and then into the future, we're really looking at how tech can enable humans to be more human, for it to be more integrated into your personal and professional lives. So the key driver for us here as a business, but also for L&D more broadly, is about really making people's lives easier so that they can perform better, that they can feel supported, and also to develop as people. So well worth a read. And I think Rich will be able to share the link to that report in the background as well, if you're interested in getting your teeth into that later on today.
Cool. Okay, so the three kind of key topics that we're going to be considering for the bulk of this session are measuring success, AI adding value, and inclusive learning. Measuring success, again, we've touched on this in previous years, but very much we're wanting to kind of have a bit of a think back on what have we learned, what have we seen people doing that maybe makes life a little bit easier, and what are the ways in which we're kind of seeing the best success around this. And I think also, how can we enable maybe the kind of right terminology, the right words in conversations in order to help that communication with the wider business? Ultimately, there's a lot that we do within our teams and within our businesses that we believe delivers value, and being able to demonstrate that value is very important. There's also elements of the work that we all do continually that actually it might not be delivering the impact that we expect it to. And there's always surprising results when you look at this kind of data. So there's also that kind of driver for this being such an important topic. AI adding value. There are, everyone has an exciting AI feature, and there's lots happening within this space. For me, it's a really interesting area to think about in terms of how we're going to make sure that we get the most value out of this, and also how we think a little bit longer term, ask ourselves the right level of questions to make sure that AI is having the impact that it needs to. I think the other topic that's interesting in this area is around governance and safety, and how do we get people to a point where they feel comfortable and confident in the way that they're working. And we've kind of got some examples and some insights that we can share in terms of what we've been seeing in that regard. And then finally, with inclusive learning and having an inclusive approach, I think, again, we've kind of previously talked about the importance of this, but ultimately, as a team, our focus is always trying to upskill people and enable them to maybe achieve something that they weren't able to achieve without our help. That's the reason why we're here, right? And so being in a place where we are doing that in a way that is sensitive to their individual needs is critical. And actually, there's a lot that's happened within the last 12 months that maybe points to an exciting future in regards to all of this. And we're going to be covering some of those things in that topic.
I think it's worth just before we move on, Mark, some of the comments in the chat around kind of those goals for the year are really focused on real human qualities like growth mindset, emotional intelligence, and curiosity. So I think it's really interesting, again, that talking about that tension between tech and being human and how those two are going to be more closely aligned as we continue into the year and beyond, that these sort of things are going to come into play and come into focus as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to do some Slido polls. And if you'd like to jump onto that link, you can see the QR code on your screen now. I'm going to talk quite slowly for a moment so that you've got an opportunity to actually see that and maybe grab that QR code. We're not going to use the QA functionality on there. Please keep your comments on LinkedIn, because it's really helpful to be able to kind of see that right here. But yeah, if you jump on there, we'll be doing some polls in just a moment. Okay, so thinking about the kind of first topic and measuring success, I mentioned earlier on, what have we learned? What have we seen in terms of maybe patterns that we can kind of avoid or try and kind of replicate? And I think we've learned a lot there in terms of, for example, starting simple, making sure that effectively that we walk before we run, getting some of the easier data in front of us and starting to pull that together into a narrative form, and thinking about how we communicate the meaning of that data fairly early on, and potentially prioritizing that before some of the really big drivers that we get asked to demonstrate ROI, we get asked to talk about how have you directly linked to that, and those kinds of metrics, those kinds of stories are sometimes quite difficult to pull together. But ultimately, being in a place where we can learn how to work with our measures and be able to kind of carry out projects and that kind of stuff before we then try and kind of get too worried about actually, is this answering the exact questions that we've got, is something that I think has been a topic throughout the year. So Helen, I think you've kind of got more to share on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of, you touched on there, that kind of fear of understanding and how to measure things on a much broader scale. And one of the things that we were encouraging people to do was think in a more granular way about what success looks like. So like you say, moving away from that kind of grander focus on ROI and bringing it back to things that you can measure on a daily basis or within a bigger time frame than a day, but that make it a bit more tangible for people to be able to pull data from the right sources in more specific means. So I just went back to the Slido poll on screen there. So hopefully people have had chance to access that. But if not, there is also a QR code on this next screen, which is the first of our polls. So again, please do scan the code if you haven't already logged on to Slido. You should now be able to see this on the link that you've got, and I can see people's results are coming through already. So how easy do you find it to articulate what success looks like? As we've said, it's sometimes a little bit tricky to really pinpoint and understand what success is for you as a team, but then also what success is for the wider business as well. So I'll just watch some of the responses coming in here. And as you can see on screen, we've got split responses here. Interestingly, no one thinks that they've got it nailed, which is disappointing because I thought people could share some of their top tips in the chat there. But there's still time. We'll see whether any come through. But also, I think perhaps not surprisingly to Mark and myself, is that it's hard to identify meaningful metrics. And we know that people do struggle with this in particular. But then the other side of that is, even if you can identify those metrics, it's actually quite hard to measure them as well. So you can identify it, but where are you going to draw that data from? How are you going to benchmark what is out there already? What does good look like? And how are you moving the needle for your own organization? And interestingly, there's a smaller percentage of people who are understanding how to measure impact, and that's probably working for them. But actually, then it's how to communicate that back into the business. So again, coming back to those points that we raised right at the beginning, it can be really hard to know where to communicate and how to communicate, particularly if you haven't necessarily set up those relationships already across a business. So something to really kind of think about there. Interesting point in the chat as well that's just come through is that when we call them metrics, we make them feel harder to measure. And that, I think that's really true. And it comes back to potentially some of the things that Mark was just touching on around actually data can feel a little bit tricky, particularly if you're only focusing on the quantitative side of it and not the qualitative. So yes, being able to upskill in data analytics and things like that is really important, but actually understanding that data isn't just necessarily numbers as well, I think is key there. Didn't know, Mark, if you had anything to add there.
No, but there's also another interesting comment just added by Aaron Price-Moore. So interesting question. I find that success is hard to find in the metrics that business leaders want to hear, not what we can offer, and this can be due to lack of transparency over the whole business. Data is data, or because the link between learning and impact isn't built into the tools that we use. And I think that is particularly key. It's actually, it's something that I think about in a business leadership manner with that hat on. It's very useful to have very broad numbers that give you a sense of how you're performing as a business. But you have to recognize that it's not possible to identify the specific kind of contributors to that metric over the course of a month or a year or whatever else it might be. And so, having those very, very broad success metrics is useful, gives everyone a frame of reference to kind of be able to discuss. But then we also have to kind of maybe recognize that there are lower level metrics that we need to look at in order to actually understand what contributes to that. And I think that's all part of this piece around dialogue and communication. Actually, it's kind of brought out through this question as well, that some people have responded that it's easy to measure impact, but hard to communicate. Certainly not the most kind of prominent response, but that is definitely something that people can kind of see and feel in the way that they're working.
And also there, another really interesting comment from Daniel Mills, which is around measuring the metrics that matter and then communicating them to relevant audiences. So not only being able to leverage those relationships, but understand what's important to them and to communicate in that respect as well. So yeah, really interesting comment there. So thank you all for taking part in that poll. Some really interesting insight shared. And I think one of the things that we're really fortunate here at Thrive to do is to work with really forward-thinking L&D teams who want to have these conversations and are open to shifting their thinking and understanding how they can trace and track impact more effectively. So as a result, we've been able to identify a few things that really stand out as common traits of teams that are doing this effectively. That they are obviously outlined on screen there. We've spoken around kind of that broader business alignment, that business acumen skill of knowing what's going on, what's commercially a focus for a business, how you can then understand and align into that, but then also understand what data is available from cross department within a business. So it's likely that as an L&D team, you're not going to be the one that holds a lot of data for a lot of the stuff that you're doing. So how do you forge those relationships as well? We've obviously spoken there around curiosity in the chat. I think that the word has come up a couple of times, at least in the conversation that's going on. And there's definitely, as L&D, we're not short of curiosity. It's what most of us have, that kind of as an innate trait. But it's definitely that willingness to learn new things and push yourself out of your comfort zone. We've mentioned growth mindset as well. We're all hopefully pushing ourselves in the right direction there. And then also we need to become more effective relationship builders. So as we look into the year ahead, if there are particular areas that you're saying, yeah, I'm definitely really good at that, or actually I could really improve in, for example, building effective relationships, and that could be a potential goal for you, either as an individual or a team, in order to get better at being able to identify what's going to matter and then communicate it back into the business as well.
I was going to say there's a comment that aligns with that really well from Rachel Jones Clark. Numbers are great, but they don't go very far when you don't listen to the voices behind those numbers. And I think that's really key. You need, in order to understand how to articulate a picture of what's going on, you need to understand the different perspectives within within the business and the different roles that are at play. And of course, through those conversations with teams and managers, it's possible to kind of understand maybe the problem from a different perspective, which sometimes can be really key to bringing out what numbers you might want to start paying attention to, or even understanding the impact that you're having in a different way that maybe you weren't aware of before. So I think that's a really key point.
Yeah, absolutely, and bringing it back to the human there. And I think it would be brilliant if L&D more broadly could get better at employee listening, as Rachel's comment alludes to there as well. So where can you start, or how can you improve? And I think there's a really interesting graph that I've pulled out, a table that I've pulled out here from CIPD Learning at Work report from last year, which focus on what those priorities are for private sector or public sector organizations. It's very simplistic, but if these are top priorities for the organization that you work in, you want to be aligning your initiatives into having an impact on these. So how are you increasing productivity? How are you reducing cost, for example? And how do your initiatives feed into those? As we said right at the beginning, if you can consider ROI as a bit more longer term and start to think more at a more granular level, whilst having sight on what that strategic vision looks like, then you're setting yourself in really good stead to be able to incrementally work towards that large goal. Again, if you can identify your broader organizational goals, that's great. I think we've worked with customers whose organizations are really great at being very transparent and clear about what goals people are working towards. But then we've also worked with businesses whose organizational goals are potentially quite tricky to understand in a really tangible way. So if that's the case, it becomes a little bit trickier in order to align more easily into them. But actually that opens up a conversation in itself that can start to happen within the business about how do people feed into those organizational goals more broadly. Obviously, it seems like common sense to say that you can then align each of your initiatives into those goals. And like I said, in terms of that kind of report that CIPD have highlighted there are particular areas and themes, productivity, time to competency, for example, are often ones, and obviously the business bottom line. Those are 3 core areas that people focus on here as well. And then determining what quantitative and qualitative data you actually have access to. Who has that access? This is something that we spoke at length about last year. It's still really important now. And again, that comes back to how do you build the relationships which allow you to find out where that data is held across the business. And then ultimately, how you define and communicate what success looks like. Obviously, we've just seen that it can be quite tricky for people to do that. It depends who you're communicating it to, what they need to know, what's important to them as well. Obviously, as L&D teams, we should always be honing in on that anyway. And then finally, let's think about regularly reviewing and adjusting your metrics, because it's not a case of we've created this metric, we're going to work towards it, but actually things change. Everything is a little bit uncertain at the moment, and landscapes change quite rapidly. So regularly revisiting and adjusting your metrics is probably quite important, and something that I think we do really well with our customers here in terms of revisiting what's important to them and what the drivers are at the moment as well. So I think there's some really interesting stuff happening on the chat there, which is brilliant. But if we just move on now to the next section, which is in terms of AI adding value into your business. So again, we've seen AI being referenced here, there, and everywhere, but actually the real focus should be on how is it adding value to you and to what you do. And I think it's really important to kind of frame how you communicate that within your business, how you approach it within your business, take a bit of a critical look at what AI is and what tools are available out there, because it's not just a case of it's a buzzword, we need to be interested in it, but actually how can it bring value to you and the initiatives that you're running. The other side of this is really, what about data protection and ethics, and how do you think about that in terms of AI? And I know Mark's got some real insight to share in that regard. As you can see, there's a QR code on screen, which is our AI roadmap. Hugely exciting times for us here at Thrive, which again, I'm sure Mark will touch on, but if you feel like downloading that, feel free to do that now. We'll just leave this slide on screen for a little bit longer so people have the chance to download it. And if not, we've got it on the last slide of our presentation too, so you can come back to it and download it there as well. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so over the last 12 months, we've been seeing pretty solid interest and awareness, growing understanding in terms of what the capabilities of AI is. I think there's an interesting topic there in terms of like what areas of AI we maybe don't have an understanding of, and we'll touch on that more in a moment. curiosity to learn more and a willingness to experiment. And again, I think we can kind of start to see some of the impact of that, not just from our own teams, but from teams across our businesses. And I mean, ultimately, if I kind of say, you know, at this point, people presumably, I would guess it would resonate if I said that people feel comfortable with the idea of AI, understand much of the kind of functionality that's being suggested at the moment, some of the types of features. There's an awareness there. But I think if we said AI is a game-changing technology, we all feel confident that we understand how it's going to change the game. That's probably a statement that would resonate less. And certainly, I think that's really where 2024 is going to be interesting, because we're going to start to need to get a grip on what we think is going to happen off the back of this technology being introduced. There's a lot of comments in terms of thinking about the relationship between artificial intelligence, human intelligence, and actually just human needs. And I'm not going to focus on that too much up front, but I think it will come back up as we kind of move forward with the topic. But yeah, there's some really interesting things there. Okay, so we've got our second poll here. And with this, we've asked the question, how does your business monitor and govern the risks associated with AI? The reason why we've kind of picked this question is because it actually gets into a couple of different aspects of the way that AI is starting to maybe roll out within organizations and the challenges that there might be there. It gives us a little bit of an insight into maybe the communications that there are and the kind of alignment that we're seeing around AI. But yeah, it's a really interesting topic for us. We've certainly seen a number of organizations now kind of just banning the use of AI full stop. And that's kind of been quite newsworthy in some cases. I think that also is something that tells us a little bit about the types of risks that we're seeing with AI. Certainly AI has risks, and depending on the kind of work that we're doing, that could be at the business level or at the team level, it may be that we are more or less susceptible to those risks. And actually that's the reason why there's kind of a variety on this. Interestingly, towards the end of last year, we also saw a number of organizations introducing kind of AI working groups. And I can see that there's 15% currently of responses where that's been done within their organizations as well, which is great. I think that is definitely a route that many organizations are taking in order to try to kind of put some framework in place and control. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in just a moment.
I think it's really interesting, Mark, that Sam in the comments there is saying that they're struggling to get people to use new updates in Microsoft Office 365. So the thought of AI puts people's backs up, but actually in brackets, ethically and morally as well, which I think is really one of the points of contention there. So as you say, it's really worth considering to add that element of safety or a safety net for people to understand how they're using it properly. Yes.
Someone just asking, is it possible to get the link to? So if you go to slido.com and use the code 0002024 or 2024, indeed, as that is the year now, that is going to allow you to get onto these polls and join us. Okay, so we'll maybe kind of check in on that later on, but I think definitely the significant kind of and the biggest response there is around kind of there being open access to artificial intelligence tools within organizations. I think that aligns quite well with what we've seen from a couple of different reports. So on the Accenture report that you were talking about before, Helen, we can kind of see that there's a recognition of the fact that AI is generally being experimented with at the grassroots, and ironically that's something that we were encouraging that last year, and I think we still are encouraging that. Ultimately, the potential for AI can be recognized at that level, and because of that, we're going to see growing demand for it coming from different teams and different departments. What's interesting now, though, is that these kinds of studies are identifying that it's becoming tricky for organizations to put governance in place around that and to manage the risk associated with it. And actually, at the moment, I think we're in a place where there's a recognized problem. Certainly that demand is being driven from the low level. There's a difficulty in applying governance to it. At the moment, there's not much discussion in terms of what the solutions to that look like. And I think that's a really interesting topic that we can probably draw some conclusions about. On the right-hand side, there's similarly a summary of an analysis done in the IBM report. And again, there's some kind of interesting thoughts there in terms of how CEOs and executives feel about the readiness of their organization for AI. Now, for me, I think that we've been discussing this over the course of the last couple of weeks, and the more that we talk about it, the more that I feel like there's actually like actionable things that we can be doing on this. But ultimately, I draw a lot of comparisons in conversations to other topics which involve risks. When we talk about AI risks, just to kind of illustrate those a little bit, in case anyone would find that useful. So, there's risks around generating information that's just not valid, for example. There's an example in the newspaper recently about a lawyer I think it was in New York, who went in front of the court and cited a load of cases that didn't exist because AI just made it up. And he had actually validated and said, like, does this definitely exist? But even then, it's kind of hard to be sure that what you're getting at generative AI is totally trustworthy. There's also similar concerns around copyright, and that's particularly worrying when it comes to the generation of kind of imagery and videos and that kind of stuff, but it also applies to text. And finally, there's very legitimate concerns around the processing of sensitive information, whether that be kind of information that is owned by a corporation or personal information, which is obviously protected under relevant laws in different territories. All of these things are examples of the kinds of risks that we see, but there are plenty of things that we do within our workplace day to day that involve dealing with things that have risks. So an example that I've been giving, and Helen will be bored of hearing me talk about by now, is COSH. So we deal with chemicals in our workplace all the time. Like, no one would question whether or not we should be using chemicals to clean things and that kind of stuff. It's a recognized, it's a necessity. We have to have those things in order to be able to do certain jobs. And I think if you look at the way in which that's been framed, over the course of my lifetime, there have been significant efforts put in place in order to introduce frames of references, things that we can refer to. It might be particular words, it might be particular ways of working and ways of analyzing and mitigating risk. But we've put those frameworks in place so that someone can kind of do a certain assessment, and that's translatable and understood across different workplaces, across a given economy, or indeed globally. And I think that's pointing in the direction that we need to be thinking about with AI. We need to be starting to talk about AI risk assessments, but crucially, we need to be enabling people to understand some of the risks in more intuitive and easy to understand ways. That risk around generating invalid information. If you illustrate that with a story like the one that I used earlier on, all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense. But the truth is, this is all completely new to us, and we've only been dealing with these tools for such a short period of time. We're going to need to continue that conversation. So in a way, we actually come back to the point around communication, which we had a moment ago.
We've also recognized in talking about this that a lot of the language that exists around AI is quite techie, and there's that kind of element of fear of, I don't necessarily understand even the words that are being used. So Mark and I created a table that you'll be able to download again at the end of the session, which tries to kind of break down some of that jargon and makes it, I guess we're trying to create a sense of standardization of terminology around AI too. So again, a handy resource for you to access at the end there.
And then as we kind of move on, so just looking at one more study, AI and L&D, the state of play, which was towards the end of last year. So this is data from 2023 ultimately, but I think it's giving us some insight in terms of where people are expecting to see benefits. And this is a little bit of a warning sign to us on a couple of fronts. The first is really that we can see the most responses are in the areas where we are currently working. If we're spending 80% of our time creating content, we see the most opportunity for it in creating content. And I think that that's okay. I'm not saying that there's anything particularly wrong with that, but I do believe that we're probably missing a little bit of an opportunity to kind of step back and ask ourselves some deeper questions about the way that we do learning within our organizations, and maybe the medium long-term opportunities that this technology might be starting to present to us. And actually, as we look down that list a little way, we can see some examples which I think are really exciting areas. Things like But so providing extra skills practice, identifying skills, providing extra knowledge testing, all of these things are very high touch. They involve a lot of effort and support from experienced people at the moment in order to make that possible for our learners. But we're starting to see tools and technologies that enable us to do that stuff in a more automated fashion, and potentially offer something that today could only be offered for a very small number of people. But instead, in the future, we're seeing the potential that could be offered to maybe everyone more ubiquitously. And that's the kind of thing where I think we've got the opportunity to see actually perhaps things could be done in quite a different way. So it's going to be an exciting year as we start to kind of think about what the impact of that is going to look like. So a few kind of key points to think about. Sorry, pardon me, I need a water. There we go. I can talk again now. 5 key points to be thinking about from us as we go into 2024 then. The first is the creation of cross-business AI working groups. It's something that we think we're going to see more and more of. It's great. I think we got up to like 17% was the kind of final number for places where we've already seen that happen. And so I think that's going to be something that increases more and more throughout the first half of this year. What's really important then is that we start to make it easier for those groups to make a positive impact within the workplace. So whether that be establishing simple terminology, providing risk assessments that people can carry out quite easily in order to understand what they're playing with and what they might need to do to make that happen safely. Also kind of shifting the frames that we're thinking away from like what we're doing today, day to day, and how we can make our current roles easier and our current processes easier, and instead taking a step back and asking some bigger questions about what problems we're really trying to solve. I think the examples that we touched on, some of the comments earlier on in terms of, how do we put people at the heart of this? How do we make sure that there's like human intelligence within this as well, is a really key element. And that is a question that will come up when we really start to ask these bigger questions. Sometimes I also have to highlight, these are the questions that might sound stupid. It might just be like, well, how are we doing that? And why are we doing that? And often it requires a team to be patient with one another and actually just to be willing to kind of like take that step back and kind of go over everything. And then I think finally, like thinking strategically. So we touched on that a couple of times, but with AI in particular, there's a number of areas where AI is just not able to do what it needs to do right now. There are problems in terms of how can you have confidence about the output it's going to get, and we need to find solutions to those challenges. One of the comments that I'm looking at here from Jenny Yearsley, so I find with things like ChatGPT, you lose the voice of the person and everything just sounds so generic. And I think, again, like there's a lot of opportunity in that as well, because we can personalize, we can change the tone of voice through those interfaces. But yes, I agree. There's also like if we look at GPT 3.5, for example, now I'm doing the technical stuff, but like some of the older algorithms, we kind of get a weird, like slightly generic tone of voice, and we can kind of start to see how that might be shifting and improving even with some of the more modern tools that we're seeing coming out right now. So yeah, that's kind of that's a few key points to be thinking about. Helen, anything else to add on that front?
I think I've seen and heard quite a few large-scale organizations who have outright kind of banned ChatGPT are setting up those working groups, as you've just mentioned, Mark, but they've also created kind of experimentations within their business to look at their own GPTs. So they're creating GPTs that work off a set parameter of information. And I think this is where stuff like policy can become, as a text-based content, can become quite interesting and can formulate conversation in a way that aligns with the business, that is ring-fenced by the business as well. So it's interesting to see that starting to happen, and also leaning into that idea of experimentation and learning fast from things that you're doing is stuff we've been speaking about since last year. And it's good to see that is happening with AI, and people are, yes, ring fencing security of what they're doing, but actually at the same time, they're being experimental in doing that too. So it kind of seems like a polar opposite, but it's going to lead to maybe something that's more secure and more successful for their business as a result. Certainly, yeah, and it's a massive area in this. I'm kind of holding back the things that I want to kind of highlight. There are additional questions, yeah, but I suppose one of the things I would highlight that comes to mind and is a topic for us quite a bit is
making sure that when we're using these technologies, we need to recognize that they are massive, like it's literally in the name, LLM large. So we are doing a lot of processing. We're doing an awful lot of kind of inefficient work when we use an LLM, or other forms of algorithms as well. The key point I'm trying to drive at is we need to think about efficiency of that as well. Every time that we use a processor and we do a lot of work like that, we are actually using energy, we're using resources. And so there's also an important point for us to think about in terms of whether or not we need the resources to be, need the features that we're talking about, or actually whether it's just something of a kind of a shiny thing. So there's lots of reasons to kind of really think through carefully whether or not we're employing things correctly.
And if we're thinking of metrics here, I think it would be a really good chance to look at the cost attached to ChatGPT if you're rolling out your own one internally, and how much it's costing you as a business to start with, then honing that down into something that might be less costly in the future. So that would be potentially an interesting look at what that might mean for the business.
So, well, we'll move on to the topic of creating inclusive learning. We're hoping that we'll have a chance for a Q&A at the end. So we've been kind of highlighting comments as we go through. We're going to come back to some of your points a little bit later on. But yeah, in terms of creating inclusive learning, really, I think I mentioned earlier on, like for me, this is the thing that gets us out of bed in the morning. And it has always, throughout my career, there's been that thing of how can I reach someone and help them to kind of understand a new topic or a new skill, and help them to kind of get to somewhere that they couldn't get to, maybe without some support. That is the kind of the measure of whether or not we're being successful and whether or not we're having an impact. I think there's a number of elements that are really exciting within this, especially as we talk about AI as an example. But as we look at the tools, maybe ask ourselves big questions about the way that we're working, in the way that I was just touching on a moment ago. Actually, that gives us an opportunity to kind of just look back and say, when we put this out in this strict format and it's only available in that way, is that the best way for us to be doing it now? Or are there opportunities for us to introduce a more personalized and independent approach that could actually work better for people? And so, Helen, over to you on this one. Like, what have you been thinking about?
Yeah, I think really it's that it's very exciting, the possibility that AI is bringing into creating more inclusive learning. But ultimately, I guess, how does tech break down the silos that exist within our organizations and ultimately enable better access to learning as a result? And therefore also, how do you communicate that more effectively across an organization as well? So I think there's lots of opportunities here for AI in particular. But as we head into the rest of the year, more broadly, it's also, well, how do you, even if you're not utilizing AI, how are you thinking about that holistic experience and bringing it back again to the employee experience and those touch points that are happening within your business? Things like imagery, tone of voice, language, media, accessibility of those things, and I guess providing access to talent, whether that's in a remote way or a hybrid way, is really important and significant here. And I think a more engaged and valued workforces come as a result of creating more diverse solutions for people and providing access in a diverse way. So on that note, I think it'd be really interesting, again, if this is the final poll of the session, but if you could just load Slido and answer the question of what are the main ways in which inclusivity is a consideration in the ways that you work or upskill. So it'll be interesting to see, again, what answers come through here in terms of whether inclusivity is embedded within the strategy of your organization already, whether it's done on a kind of a project by project basis, or maybe it's not even spoken about with a clear direction, and there's not necessarily a clear understanding of how you should be approaching it. Positive to see that so far one of our voters has voted 100% on embedded in our strategy, and again, I think it's my prediction, with only a few people answering, is that it's going to be fairly evenly split across all of these answers. And again, interesting there that there is a smaller number of people that they want to focus on it more, with a more practical solution, which, again, to our point previously, Mark, is that something that is really close to being able to happen in a different way now with AI. Although there is technology obviously out there that creates those more inclusive experiences to start with, but how can we enhance that with new technology that's coming into the market? Interestingly, there's quite a large proportion here of people answering around it's spoken about with no clear direction on how we should be approaching it. So there's a potential opportunity there to, again, start thinking a little bit more strategically about what this means and how you can create those experiences, which is really fundamental if you're wanting to create an organization where people come and enjoy and they experience a sense of belonging within your business, and they're able to upskill, they're able to perform well, and they're able to see what value they're bringing to the organization and what the organization can feed into their career development as well. So as Kurt said in the comments, true inclusivity is possible, and we'd like to obviously think that is a state that we will ultimately get to. And I really genuinely think AI is going to be the driver of those more inclusive experiences.
He said impossible.
Oh, Kurt, you've let me down. See, my Freudian slip shows the positive attitude that I've got to inclusivity. So to counter, Kurt's raised a really interesting point around true inclusivity is impossible. I'd counteract that with, is it? And are we able to ever get to a point where everyone has access to the right things at the right time in ways that suit them? Ultimately, I feel like that is a utopia that we will get to at some point within our working lives. At what point that is remains to be seen. So in that regard, what is L&D doing well right now? Well, from an accessibility perspective, I've certainly seen an uptake in people talking about accessibility more broadly over the past year or so. It's been a topic of conversation that's being pushed for much longer than that, but I've certainly seen an uptake in people's focus on it and communicating how they're doing it and why they're doing it for all the right reasons, obviously, which is great because it also shows that L&D teams have a real focus on getting better, understanding what they're doing well and how they can start to implement the feedback that they receive in terms of whether something has been as accessible as it could be for certain audiences. I think there's also been an increased scrutiny of the standards that are out there for people to rely on. So WCAG obviously is the main framework that people use to assess accessibility, but we always forget that that is a web design standard rather than a digital learning standard. So lots of what is included in there isn't actually applicable to digital learning. So how do you take that as an element of guidance for what you're creating? And again, this comes back to one of the audience members' previous points around how you can leverage what people are telling you and listen to what people say and match that with a better understanding of the frameworks to bring them closer together. We've also seen a much clearer focus on marketing learning. That's been a real positive over the past 12 months. That feeds into how you provide access to people at the right time and bring them along on that journey with you. The whole point around kind of effective marketing there is around reaching the right people at the right time and providing access to the relevant information for them. Again, something that we'll definitely see improving, even though we're already kind of on that journey, which is brilliant. One thing that is worth noting is the CIPD report here that I referenced earlier actually highlights the fact that public sector and voluntary organisations are actually focusing more on DE&I than the private sector. Potentially not a huge surprise to us, but what that means is there's huge lessons to be learned there from the public sector, and they can feed into the private sector's approach to inclusivity and accessibility in particular. We know that public sector and voluntary organisations often start with the person first and then create things that are accessible to as broad an audience as possible, whereas historically a lot of private sector organisations have focused on what's a nice to have rather than a must have. So lessons to be learnt there from those teams, I think. So it'd be nice to see those conversations starting to happen, hopefully, as we head through the year. But where are the opportunities this year? Well, this kind of, again, touches on some of the things that we've already mentioned in terms of how you make learning materials that are more accessible to the right audiences, to the right people. And again, that is creating something that is unique to an individual's need. Again, potentially quite far in the distance, but it's something that is being worked towards and something to focus on. And then I guess creating that kind of inclusive learning environment is something that is fundamental to self-development and professional development within an organization, and again links into that sense of belonging. And as my point says, it feeds into that kind of greater sense of belonging through that transparency of communication, of the ways that things are shared within an organization, how they're marketed to people as well. And then ultimately, how do you utilize tech to collaborate with others to create those better learning experiences? We hear a lot around how people should be collaborating more, should be communicating more, should be leveraging all that good kind of social learning that happens. And how do you kind of make sure that that is happening in very organic ways that feed into that broader professional development and increased performance ultimately at the end of the day? So lots of food for thought there, and I'll pass back over to Mark to kind of, I suppose, wrap it all up.
Yeah, I'll just quickly summarize. I've only got 5 minutes left and some time for questions, but these, again, kind of going back to the problems that we talked about and the thing that led us into talking about these focus areas. Ultimately, with all of these, it's an opportunity for us to think strategically. Where do we want to be at the end of the year? What are the things that we might want to do in terms of maybe approaching some of these problems differently and making opportunity to kind of do that that's part of the way that we're working. You need an opportunity to kind of schedule that a little bit and kind of lean into it. The other element that's critical through all of this is our employee experience, or the experience of our learners, and really where we're seeing that kind of being put front and center is where we're getting an opportunity to really understand the impact. And that's something that we would kind of just encourage everyone on. Again, we kind of said it last year in terms of user feedback and part of that communication that we've seen discussed in the comments today. But ultimately, as a team, we want to be in a place where we are understanding the impact that we're having. We're feeling good about that kind of measured success, and perhaps that we've also got some ideas about how we might want to adjust our strategy, change our plan as we move forward. And that's really the way in which we're going to get to a point that we've got the best results out of the end of the year. And so, yeah, that's kind of the wrap up and the key thing to kind of end things on. I think, Helen, you've kind of got a couple of bits to share.
Yeah, so just some, obviously we don't like to leave you empty-handed here at Thrive. So we've got as I mentioned earlier, a downloadable resource that you can feel free to scan the QR code at the top right and download our Gen AI jargon buster that again comes back to this point that we need to start to standardize our terminology across the industry, and hopefully will be a part of driving that. The other side of this, again, is the link to the AI roadmap, Thrive's AI roadmap. So you can see all the exciting stuff that we've got planned and what our vision for our product is. So also feel free to download that as well as you go. And we'll leave these on screen whilst we just do a quick round of Q&A. Conscious we've probably got about 2 minutes left to do that effectively. But it would be worth, if anyone has any specific questions, then feel free to ask them in the chat. Otherwise, I think we highlighted a couple as we went through, the first of which was from someone called Sam Goodman, which was, is there a risk of neglecting the human skills first before jumping in and exploring AI? Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
I think, oh gosh, I knew that was coming and I didn't prepare it in my mind or what I was going to answer for that. There's a lot that we can do with AI that doesn't involve us neglecting human skills. I think that there are ways in which we're seeing AI coming up as a way of making our roles easier. There's also, as I said earlier on, opportunities for us to do stuff at scale that previously we've only ever been able to do in very kind of specific locations. I don't feel like any of that negates the kind of the human first approach that most learning teams take. I also think that there are ways in which we can make AI the focus in a way that it shouldn't be. And ultimately, if we're kind of analyzing our success on the basis of have we implemented AI this, have we implemented AI that, that's not the right approach. And this comes back to really the point about measuring our impact, talking about success. And I think that, yeah, while we're doing that and we're looking at, do the teams that we support feel that they're getting a positive impact from the work that we're doing? And critically, do they feel that they can come to us and bring problems that we can support them with? Those are the kinds of things that we should continue to ask ourselves and should be kind of core to what we're doing. That will help to ensure that we are putting people first in all of this.
And I think there's a second question that's come through from Maya Johnson, which is around she feels like she's really great at relationship building, but still struggles to get a seat at the table. My initial take on that is around yes, it's difficult to get a seat at the table, but actually, again, how are you showcasing value and therefore talking about what's important to people at the right time? So in those relationships that you're building, are you able to showcase value within those specific relationships? And then that kind of feeds into those broader organizational goals as well. Mark, you might have something to add to that, because I know that you highlighted this one.
Yes, I mean, we've had a couple of comments around this that sometimes it's hard to get your message across and to share the impact that you're having, and that totally resonates with me. There are some really inspirational stories which I don't probably have time to share those, but I think if you can come up with a way to visualize the impact that you're having, and maybe find some key numbers that kind of tell that story, find people that can kind of support you in terms of highlighting and complementing the work that you've been doing. I think that's a key way that you can then get the message out in terms of what you've been doing. Sometimes you do need to kind of go on the campaign a little bit and trumpet your cause, and that's kind of a key way that you can kind of make a change on that front.
I think just to add, because I'm conscious we're at time, but Dr. Keith Keating has a really good book on a trusted learning advisor, and his view is that you don't necessarily need to have a seat at the table. You can obviously make your own table, but also bring people along on that journey with you, which I think is quite an interesting take. So I would recommend you listening to his, reading his book as well. I'm conscious we are at time for any more questions. It's been a really interactive session, so really appreciate you all sharing and commenting and taking part in the polls as well. Obviously, feel free to follow up with myself or Mark via LinkedIn if you want to afterwards. And thank you all so much for joining today.
Thank you, everyone.